All right, so we're going to continue our conversation about congruency, and we're going to be working on Unit 7, Lesson 3, all right, and on page 68 in your workbook. And you can look at Standard 16.2 here. I can use the definition of congruent triangles to show corresponding parts of triangles are congruent. And so really what this idea is that once we use our shortcuts to show that two triangles are congruent, what we then know is that all the other corresponding parts, all right, are also going to be congruent. So once we know the two triangles are congruent, we know then all corresponding parts are congruent as well. All right. So if we go through the opener here, right, and you can pause that and go ahead and do, based on your congruency statement here, list the corresponding angles and list the corresponding sides. All right, and then pause, or excuse me, flip it back on, and we'll see how you did. All right. So once again, when we look at our congruency statement, we know angle A corresponds to X. Now, because these triangles are congruent, we know angle A has to be congruent to angle X. All right, same thing with B and Y. So angle B has to be congruent to angle Y. All right, and then angle C has to be congruent to angle Z. All right, so all the corresponding angles have to be congruent. Now, same thing for sides, right? So AB corresponds to XY. So that means AB has to be congruent to XY. And then BC corresponds to YZ. Oops. Congruent to YZ. If I get my symbols there correctly. And then AC, all right, is going to be congruent to XZ. All right. So the idea that we're going to focus on is that once we show that triangles are congruent, right, we then know that all their parts are congruent. So when we get to our notes here, notice congruent figures have the same angles and sides, right? Okay. All right, and then corresponding parts are in the same location, all right, in the same position, all right, however you want to say that. Now, and I'm going to kind of put this in quotes here because they may not be in exactly like on the top and the top, right? Because the triangles could be orientated differently, all right? So when we say the same position, that means if you draw them the same way, all right? So for example, if I just come up here and draw this triangle right here, correct? All right, so notice my right angles, right, would be corresponding parts, right? And they would be congruent corresponding parts. But notice they're not in the same position as far as like, oh, this angle isn't up to the right. There's not an angle in the upper right here. So that's if we were to draw them or position them in the same way. So just want to make sure we're good on what we mean by same position or same location. All right. And then when we look at what we have here, right, what we know is that congruent figures, right, have, all right, congruent corresponding parts. All right, so let's take a look then at number 1 down here. Let me just move my camera a little bit. There we go. All right, so use your knowledge of transformations to help answer the questions. So what segment corresponds to KH? All right, and this is kind of what we mean by the same position. So I got to kind of look and see, all right, what KH corresponds to, all right, and then if I got to imagine if I had to kind of flip and rotate KH, and it would be in the same position as OL. All right, so once again, we say same position, you may have to kind of trace them or turn them, make sure that they're in kind of that same position. All right, so angle L, right, okay, would correspond to, all right, angle H here, all right, and so we can kind of see that with, all right, the segment that we wrote as well. All right, so there you go. All right, if we flip to page 69, all right, so we look at our wings here of our SR-71 Blackbird, and it suggests that we have congruent triangles, and we would hope the wings would be congruent, correct? All right, and it tells us that we want to find the measure of angle D here. All right, and so when we see this, it says that these are congruent triangles, and so notice angle B and angle E correspond, and they are congruent. So notice that means angle C and angle F would also have to be congruent, all right, because those correspond to each other. So if C is 75, that means F is 75. And then what we know, right, is all three angles in a triangle have to add up to 180 degrees, correct? So these two are 105 together, so that means that the measure of angle D would have to be 75 degrees as well to get us to 180. 80 degrees. All right, so hopefully that kind of gets you, all right, kind of understanding kind of what we mean by those corresponding parts being congruent. So now, notes on using corresponding parts, right? So the first thing that we have to do, all right, is we have to prove, right, that our triangles are congruent. Right? So remember, we only know corresponding parts are congruent if the triangles themselves are also congruent. All right? Okay, then we have to kind of match, all right, our corresponding parts. All right, in our triangles. All right, so there you go. You only have 4 problems here, problems 3, 4, 5, and 6 to complete. All right, and I'll see you in our next video.